professor of history at Lund University, and is a Wallenberg Academy Fellow funded by the Knut and Alice Wallenberg Foundation. This is very close to our hearts in Tel Aviv University, where we have been giving scholarships or to honor Wallenberg, Raoul Wallenberg, for more than 30 years. He, of course, has a PhD in history and other achievements. Following postdoctoral fellowships, he was a visiting professor at the University of Vienna and a visiting senior fellow at the National University of Singapore, which is really a very intriguing choice, no doubt. In 2015, his book, The Rise and Fall of Belarusian Nationalism, 1906-1931, won an important prize in Polish studies from the Association for Slavic and East European and Euro-Asian Studies. So he is on his way definitely to become very central, even more than he is now in the field. And he has the next 20 minutes. He will be speaking about the miracles of Sambir harmony or the shame of Sambir, myth, memory, and the crosses on the Jewish cemetery in Sambir, Ukraine. Also a very intriguing title, it seems. Please.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see here, the host has asked to start your video. I'm doing it now. I'm starting it here now, unable to start the video. Do you see and hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, very good. I was unable to start, but now I'm here. Thank you so very much for organizing this important conference, and thank you, Professor Porat, for your kind introductory remarks here. I really want to acknowledge Marcela Bendror's fine work on this very timely conference. Little did we know that we would again be facing a major war in Europe and Ukraine be under attack by a nuclear great power, as this conference is running, as Yura Radchenko mentioned. I think this is a reminder of the importance of focusing on war crimes, war criminality, atrocities, and to keep these focuses also at a time of war, where it indeed might be difficult to raise these issues, not least given how the Russian Federation motivating its war of aggression by references to Ukrainian Nazis. And I think we cannot emphasize enough that how important it is to really engage this topic in a scholarly, critical fashion, not least to prevent the instrumentalization by multiple actors of this topic. And this was something that I had in mind when I wrote this article in 2019. I finished writing it 1.5 years ago. Didn't anticipate a situation like this. And it's dealing with, in many ways, the afterlife of the topics that Yuri Radchenko discussed, and to some extent connects also to what Grzegorz Rosaliński-Lieb is working on. I'm dealing with contemporary history. On the 21st of August 2019, and a monument was opened at the, almost physically, directly at the place of the Holocaust massacre site in Sambir, where Julian Temnik, among others, were active, a monument to the Bandera wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists at the very grave site of this Holocaust massacre. The memorial was shaped as a Christian cross, but in the with their own logotype or their own emblem, using both this their own aesthetics and the Christian cross. And it appeared as a result of a rather intriguing historiographical prehistory. As this monument was opened on the 21st of August 2019, present there was the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Dov Blaich, who describes himself as the main rabbi of Ukraine, but also the Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Vashchuk, flanked by field pastors and by field chaplains Canadian flags, but also the black and red Blut und Boden, the blood and soil flag of the Bandera wing of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. This made it to the news, into the headlines, and Radio Canada International reported on this. Jerusalem Post picked up the story. Post Media, which is sort of a corporate news agency in Canada that writes for many of the local newspapers across Canada, picked up this story, and it triggered an historiographical firestorm of kinds with very predictable positions. And in many ways, it's interesting because it illustrates the difficulties at this point to address certain aspects of the recent past. As was mentioned here by some of the previous speakers, also talking on Sambir, Sambir was roughly 1/3 Jewish prior to World War II. There was a violent pogrom taking place on July 1st, 1941, following the opening of the NKVD prisons. There had been a very brutal, particularly brutal NKVD massacre of inmates, many of which were Ukrainian nationalists, as they retreated in wake of the German invasion, and Ukrainian militia organized by the Bandera wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists took part in the pogroms that followed. The Jews of Sambir, the bulk of them, however, were murdered in 1942 and in 1943. And in the summer of 1943, the city of Sambir was declared Judenrein. Less than 100 Jews survived the Holocaust in Sambir out of roughly 6,000. But however, as my colleague Matthias Kaltenbrunner at the University of Vienna wrote a book called the Global Vernetzte Dorf, the globally connected village, is arguing that also local history is global history. And there is no such thing as you can own a local history of an event, particularly not in a borderland, in a multi-ethnic or formerly multi-ethnic borderland. And a few of the survivors of the Holocaust, the few that survived or left before the war, ended up in Canada, also United States and Israel, but some of them ended up in Canada. And one of them was Jack Gardner of Victoria, BC. He was born in 1914, and he worked for much of his life to restore the cemeteries in Sambir and return their dignity. He already tried under Khrushchev in the 1960s to return to Ukraine and mark this massacre site, which was now overgrown and dilapidated, and turned into some sort of memorials to be set up there. This was not possible, and in 1975, following the Yom Kippur War, according to the city architect of Sambir, as part of a Soviet anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli campaign, they were bulldozing the cemetery of Sambir, a cemetery where the headstones were still standing. The cemetery goes back to at least 1732, to the first Polish Rzeczpospolita. That is, it is older also than the Austro-Hungarian Empire, probably predates that. But it was bulldozed, the headstones were destroyed, and the cemetery at the time the Soviet Union collapsed was in a miserable, dilapidated state. And there were no Jews, virtually no Jews left in Sambir. Jack Gardner worked also with a fellow by the name of Mark Freiman, who was for a few years the president of the Canadian Jewish Congress. He worked with fundraising in connecting with a number of agents in trying to get some sort of dignity restored to this cemetery as a memorial space. In the early 1990s, partially due to the efforts of Jack Gardner, the Jewish memorial had been raised, a Star of David raised on the massacre site of roughly 2,000 Jews at the Sambir cemetery. They were, however, bulldozed and turned down, and 3 oversized birch crosses, Christian crosses, erected directly on the Holocaust massacre site, partially in involvement with the local priests and local Ukrainian nationalists, objecting to the idea of foreign and Jewish symbols on Ukrainian ground. So after that, from 1993 onwards, the long struggle started in how to remove these Christian crosses, which were not least by Jack Gardner and other survivors, seen as an affront to Jewish memory and grossly ahistorical. And how to get rid of these crosses and to create a memory environment which be inclusive, but primarily recognizing the Jewish Holocaust at the site of their massacre started. And local activists, such as the Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Svoboda Party, Ruch, a number of memory agents, strongly objected to the removal of the Christian crosses. And Jack Gardner and later on Mark Fryman's work consisted in trying to navigate this environment, trying to get rid of the crosses and get something else in its place. In the year 2019, it seemed that time was ripe to get rid of the crosses and get up a different memorial there. In the process of getting this compromise, Fryman and the people he was working with agreed to setting up a plaque to the organization of Ukrainian nationalists as a bargain to get rid of the crosses. They would not put up a memorial, but only a plaque. But as these negotiations were carried out, an elderly gentleman showed up at the city hall negotiations. He claimed to be a brother of a murdered OUN-B patriot, murdered by the Germans in 1944. Indeed, he claimed that no less than 17 teenagers, members of the clandestine Bandera wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, had been murdered on the site of the Jewish cemetery, and therefore there should also be a memorial set up to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists at the Jewish gravesite. And he came already prepared with a sketch for how this memorial should look. And the memorial should include the emblem of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. It should have the size of a cross and should be erected essentially on the Jewish cemetery. This, of course, again, complicated the situation, but an agreement was reached, and the idea was on 21st of August 2019 to get a ceremony to have this crosses removed and a plaque to the UN set up there. The day before this was to be carried out, a vigilante group or a militia group known as the Dobrovolsky Battalion UN, or the voluntary battalion of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, cordoned off the area, prevented the removal of the crosses, and announced that this whole process would be interrupted. At that point, Dov Blaich, the main rabbi of Ukraine, pulled out, but after some wranglings and negotiations in which the Dobrovolsky Battalion UN agreed to have the major cross removed, it was decided to have the ceremony be carried out nevertheless. So they were. And these pictures were cabled out over the world and led to controversy. Jerusalem Post, where Sam Sokol reported about this, and Radio Canada International, which is international branch of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, carried a long article about this. And this is how I got informed about this. They called me here in Sweden to ask about this, and I gave them the background about this. And in the beginning, I had a hard time really understanding that this would happen. But yes, fair enough. There was a monument to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists erected on the site, and of course, this led to an historiographical argument in which part of the Jewish community were outraged to have a monument to, as Edvard Dolinsky, one of the leaders of the other Ukrainian Jewish organization, presented this as glorifying the perpetrators at the site of the massacres of Jews. Others who also have taken a more conciliatory tone, such as Josef Sissel, the leader of Avad, also he expressed concern about this essentially distortion of history. But it also triggered a very predictable argument. But it also brought in Canada into this situation, because the Canadian ambassador, Roman Vasychuk, delivered a eulogy at the opening of this memorial, in which he essentially said, well, it's important to remember the crimes of the Nazis, the Holocaust, but also to commemorate Ukrainian heroes that rescued Jews during the Holocaust. and to recognize the heroism of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. Essentially, it's following a very well-established pattern in many post-communist countries. It's not very different from Poland and Lithuania, where 80–90% of the books on the Holocaust deals with the righteous, right? The righteous Lithuanians, righteous Ukrainians, righteous Poles that rescued Jews during the Holocaust. So it's a very distorted sort of view in that sense. But the Canadian ambassador, flanked by Canadian military personnel with an OUN black and red banner, glorified the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. This was, of course, as we say in German, and we have this expression in Swedish, gefundenes Fressen. This was sort of like a penalty kick against an open goal for not least for Russian propaganda, who picked up this issue and made it a part of news briefs coming out of TASS, the Russian news agency, presenting this, of course, very much along the lines of the Russian propaganda today. That essentially, Ukrainian Nazis, after the coup of Yanukovych, are now honoring the perpetrators on a Jewish gravesite. So this was presented by the head of the media report from Ukrainian Catholic Church as a miracle of Sambir harmony, that Jews and Ukrainians could jointly celebrate the OUN at the Jewish gravesite. We recognize their suffering, they recognize ours. That was sort of like the Ukrainian Catholic Church take on this, whereas Jewish groups presented this as the eternal shame of Sambir. And many of them saw this indeed as a disgrace, to have the symbols and the monument to the perpetrators at the site of a Jewish massacre, where we know Ukrainian nationalists of both wings of the OUN participated. This really boils down to what a lack of what the Germans would call Aufarbeitung, the lack of digestion, the lack of processing. Myths such as 17 essentially fictional Ukrainian nationalist teenagers supposedly killed at the Jewish gravesite, and therefore we need to glorify the OUN at the site of Jewish murder. It sort of like resonates a little bit with a similar discourse taking place in Babyn Yar, where the Ukrainian authorities also erected a monument to the OUN Melnik faction and 621 mostly fictional OUN Melnikite nationalists supposedly shot at Babyn Yar. Thereby, the inference is that the OUN shared the plight of the Jews. They were co-victims of the Holocaust and not perpetrators, right? A lack of Aufarbeitung, a sort of fictional account which is more about memory than history. And when I wrote this article not to depict Ukrainians as irresponsible thugs or fascists or whatnot, but rather for the quite opposite reason, that we need, particularly now, as we now know more than we ever had before. We have now access to SBU, Ukrainian intelligence archives. We have the CIA documentation. We have Polish, we have German archives. We have now essentially the ability to reconstruct in great detail, for instance, the Holocaust on a micro level, such in Sambir and study Sambir. We have this ability. And at the same time, the memory, the representation of this is drifting away from what historians actually know. The gulf between historical knowledge and wishful thinking or myth is growing. And this is indeed a political liability. In the Ukrainian case, this has actually played into the hands of the Russian propaganda. It allowed the TASS to present Ukrainians as co-perpetrators and then covering this up. You need to have the critical engagement of this. And I think that's important to point out, even now during this most difficult of times, that when the immediate survival of the Ukrainian state is in question. But these issues won't go away. And what we see, I guess, it's a question of whether a glass is half full or half empty. The Ukrainian state has not been very interested in addressing these issues of the Holocaust and the role of the OUN in the Holocaust. It has passed laws to criminalize what they call disrespect for the organization of Ukrainian nationalists. At the same time, a young generation of scholars, many of them born in the 1980s and 1990s, have emerged and are really slowly, little by little, changing how also Ukrainians perceive the Holocaust. These include scholars like Sofia Grachova, Yura Radchenko, who is present here today, Galina Kutsovska, I saw here also, Andrei Osach, Marta Havryshko was mentioned. Up and coming younger scholars partially trained in the West, which are bringing with them their experiences to Ukraine with funding and research experience from the US Holocaust Museum, from Yad Vashem, from Ukrainian, from German sponsors. And slowly, little by little, the young generation of Ukrainians are, on the one hand, the approval of the UN and OPA is greatly increasing as a result of Ukrainian memory politics. On the other hand, an awareness of the Holocaust is increasing. Ukraine is arguably 10 or 15 years behind Poland and 5 years behind Lithuania. But you see this divided memory, also an awareness increasing. So had this volume been released on the 60th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, a volume appeared in 2002, if Graciela had done this 20 years earlier, you would not have much research at all by Ukrainian scholars. Even such prominent scholars such as Georgy Kasyanov, when he wrote in his report, this evaluation, this government report on the UN and UPA, did not really mention the Holocaust. That appeared in 2005. Today, 2022, not only do we know so much more about this, we also have an emerging Ukrainian scholarship appearing. And that, I think, is no major feat. And the importance here of integrating not only Western Israeli scholars, but also Ukrainian scholars, I think is very much the way to go. So I really want to thank both the organizers for this initiative, not only scientifically, academically, but also as bridge builders between different historiographical tradition and supporting Ukrainian scholarship, which is more important than ever these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This was as well, we're lucky to have such a panel. It is such a panel with two fascinating lectures. And you really brought up a very important and very timely point about how memory and wishful memory are deviating from history and from the writing of history. And you brought a fascinating and much to the point example, and also anchored it in what we are witnessing today, in what is happening today, right? And we are witnessing history again. So thank you very much. We wish you a good continuation of this work, enlargement of the topic that you have chosen, and really thank you very much also for keeping the time. Thank you from Tel Aviv to Sweden.